So welcome to the Remote Management with PowerShell module. In this one, we're really going to dive into using remote connectivity, how I can actually connect to remote machines and what's required, how I can then execute PowerShell, and then really magnifying the power of PowerShell by performing operations on multiple machines at the same time. And this is where you fully start to realize what this is capable of. Hey, yes, I can run a command locally, and hey, yes, I can run a command on a remote machine, but I can run those same commands on 10, 100, 1,000 machines at the same time. Now, the goal of PowerShell is to provide this centralized management of an entire IT environment. You'll hear them talk about the goal of PowerShell was a universal code execution environment. The idea that I have this piece of code, I might want to run it locally, I might want to run it remotely, or against many remote boxes. I may want to run that code as me or as someone else. I want the response right now. Hey, I want it to run in the background and then I can fetch the results when I want. It may run for a really, really long time. So I need to be able to maybe pause it, resume it, maybe even reboot the box. We have things like workflows to enable that. But that was the goal. And so remote management is a huge part of realizing that vision. Therefore, performing actions on remote machines is critical. And being able to perform actions on multiple remote machines is even more critical. Now, being able to do things remotely is not new. We've had remote procedure calls for a long time. For example, when I talk to domain controllers, I'm using DCOM, and that is over RPC. Now, this uses a whole set of different ports. It can be very hard to configure on a firewall. Now, some services would enable you to force RPC to a specific port, so then I could do some firewall configuration. But what normally happened was, we'll just disable the firewall. And that's obviously terrible. But that's what people did. It's like, oh, I cannot get this thing to work. Hey, look, if I disable the firewall, then I'm good to go. That's a huge security problem. So Microsoft has been steadily moving away from RPC. And what it's moving to is WinRM. So WS Management, is a standard protocol for remote management. It uses HTTP and HTTPS, and WinRM is the Windows implementation of that protocol. Although it's operating on HTTP and HTTPS, it doesn't use port 80 or 443. I mean, it did in the very early versions, but it doesn't anymore, because when it operated on the standard ports, it would conflict with other services. If I was trying to run a web server on that box, well, it would clash with WinRM. And so WinRM by default will use port 5985 for HTTP, 5986 for HTTPS if you enable it. HTTPS is not enabled by default. And in production environments, it is recommended to use HTTPS, because then what's happening is I'm getting that additional level of encryption. Now, even regular commands are encrypted when I'm using Kerberos. So as part of the remote machines, I'm authenticating with Kerberos. We use Kerberos to encrypt. If I use HTTPS, then I'm also encrypting the entire tunnel. So I'm getting that double encryption. I could also use IPsec. IPsec, though, tends to be a bit more complex to actually go and set up. So WinRM is forming this foundation of our remote management. And this is not unique to PowerShell. If you look at things like Server Manager, that is using WinRM. More and more of Windows, and in fact we can go beyond Windows. Linux, there's OMI. I can use WinRM to talk to Linux as well. Now, WinRM is actually installed by default on Windows 2008 R2 and above. That also had PowerShell v2. And it is enabled by default on Windows 2012 and above, because with Server 2012, WinRM is basically used for everything. We had Server Core. With Server Core, I had no GUI. And so we needed that remote management to just be there by default. Now, this should give you an idea of the amount of security checking Microsoft did with WinRM. Often you might find your security or network people get concerned that you're turning on this WinRM or you're using it. In each new version of Windows, Microsoft normally turns stuff off. This was one of the rare occasions they turned something on by default, because it's not enabling any backdoors. I still have to have the permissions, but it's so core to that management framework. They did so much checking. They attacking themselves through their red and their blue teams. They actually felt confident enough from their internal security processes that they were good enabling this by default. So you should actually kind of use that if you ever have discussions with security teams. They're like, well, we don't like this thing. Hey, look, Microsoft, who are this secure by default, like this whole security initiative, they actually enabled this by default in 2012 after all of those internal checks. I will need to enable it on client operating systems. I can do this through PowerShell. I can use enable PS remoting, or I can use group policy to do that. And I can always go and get my current configuration using get PS session configuration. Here's an example of turning this on. Just do enable PS remoting, and it's really going to do everything for you. It's going to enable WinRM for remote management, and it's going to create a listener on HTTP. So this is not HTTPS by default. I'm just turning it on for HTTPS. Here, if I actually jump over to one of my servers, if I do that get PS session configuration, you can see, yep, I've got that remote connection enabled. And I've actually got a few different endpoints I can actually connect to. I've got my standard one, I've got one for workflows, 32-bit, etc. So how do I actually run something on a remote machine? Now, some cmdlets will just have the ability to pass a computer name to it. But I can also use Invoke-Command. So Invoke-Command will send a script or individual commands that I enter to the machines I specify. So this can be one-to-many. I can also create sessions on machines and pass commands to the existing session. The benefit of using a session is that if I create a session and I run commands, then it persists the state. When I don't use a session, any commands I send are basically running within a created session automatically. It runs and the session closes. I send a second command, it opens up a new session. So there's no state in between the individual commands that I'm actually sending. So we can show this if I jump over to my PowerShell. So if I was to say, look, invoke a command on a remote machine. So by specifying computer name, I'm saying use WinRM. And I'm going to send it to domain controller. And actually, just to prove before we do anything else, hey, look, if I look at the computer name, it's spitting out the name of my domain controller. So it's running remotely. It's not on my local machine, because my local machine is that. So $env is kind of just the ability to reference all the environment variables. If I did my get PS drive, you can actually see I have an env. I have my environment. But now let's go and invoke a command then on that remote machine, and let's set a variable. So we'll say $var equals 10. And now let's just look at that. And it's blank. And the reason it's blank, remember, is because, well, I sent this command to the remote machine. It created a PowerShell session for me. It set var to 10, and then it closed the session. Then I sent another command, opened up a brand new session where that variable doesn't exist, and so obviously it's not there anymore. So that result is exactly what I would expect. Now, what about getting data back? So data is serialized into XML, sent in that XML format to my local machine, where it's deserialized back into objects. Now, we kind of saw this in a previous module, where I exported out to XML and then read it back in. It kept the object type, but it was now deserialized. The objects are no longer linked to the original objects. They lose all of the methods. So while I can look at the objects, I can't act on them directly. Also realizing serializing data to XML, those objects to XML, and then deserializing from XML back to the objects is computationally expensive. And we've talked before about we want to filter as far to the left as our command chain as we can. It limits what's returned. It limits the computation that I have to do further down the pipeline. Well, that applies here even more so. On the remote commands I send, yes, I want to kind of filter as far to the left as I can within the remote commands, but even more so, filter what I'm sending back to my machine, because the more I have, the more it actually has to serialize to XML, send it across the network, and then deserialize it back into objects. So I want to be really careful how I try and do that filtering. So if I was to go back over here again, imagine I was going to run a command, and we'll do it on our domain controller again. I'm going to run a block of code, a script block. Now I don't have to do script block. I don't even have to type computer name. I could be super lazy with this. I could just start the bit of code. But we'll do script block. And I'm going to do get event log, because this is Windows PowerShell that it's receiving it, so I can use get event log. Normally I would do on PowerShell Core get win event. And I could say log name, which is not going to tab complete because it has zero clue what get event log is, security. Okay. That's what's going to run remotely. And then I'm going to say, well, let's select object, and I want the first 10. So what is this doing? Is this a good command? It's sending remotely get event log. And then on all of the data I get back, I'm going to select the first 10. So it works. It's taking a while. There's other stuff going on because I'm still getting more data back. So it's chugging along. So I'm creating a ton of kind of overhead of it's having to fetch all of those records. Then it's having to serialize all of those records. Then I'm just grabbing 10 of them. So this is really not a good command. And you can see it's still getting so much back. This is taking a really long time. So this is a terrible example. I would never want to do this. Okay, so it's finally finished. And just for completeness, if we actually look, what am I getting back? So you can see I'm getting lots of different stuff, but I'm getting event log entries back, and it's deserialized. So that's that return. Okay, so what's a better option? Well, I could take my command again, and well, if I move this into the squiggly bracket, it's now running that remotely. And it's done. Because now on the remote side, it was getting the event logs, then it was just getting the first 10, and that's all it had to serialize, send over the network, and then get back to me. Now, there's an even better one than that, because I'm still making get event log do quite a lot of work. So I always want to try and filter as far to the left as I can, and as it happens, well, get event log has newest 10. So that's even better. That's kind of the optimal way I can do things. Same as if I do a get process. Yes, on get process, I can do all of them, and then where $_.name equals notepad. But I'm still getting more objects than I actually need back. So let's do this same thing again. and to try and really emphasize the fact that these are separate. So I can do get process. And I'm going to get all the remote processes from that domain controller. So it's all coming over, being serialized, deserialized, etc., etc. And once again, if we look at the get member, we'll see exactly what I'm getting back is a deserialized process. So it's going through, thinking, and deserialized process. So we have all of the properties, but I have none of the methods. All I get is kind of a get type and toString. Remember, that's very different from, if I do a get process locally, I get a whole bunch of methods. Close, equals, kill. I can pass it down the pipeline and stop it. So what I'm going to do is on this remote machine, I'm actually going to go ahead. So this is that remote machine. And just so you can see it, I'm going to start Notepad. This is that domain controller. So now back in this world, we're going to invoke a command. And what could I do here? Well, I could absolutely do the where $_.name equals Notepad. And I forgot the double quote. So double quote, squiggly bracket, there we go. So it's getting them all being serialized, sent over, deserialized, and then on all of the stuff I get back, I'm finding the one where it's Notepad. And that works, but you kind of see the amount of time it takes. If we run that again, just for so we can do some little experiments. If I do measure command, oh, did that the wrong way. Hold on. So actually put that at the start. So we'll go to the start of this. Measure command. It's just going to run that same command again. It's just going to tell me how long it takes. So it took a while. I mean, nearly 10 seconds. So it took a long time. If I was to just move the check, the where, into what I'm sending remotely, half a second. I'm not serializing and deserializing all that data. So this is kind of a really important thing to realize when I'm working with remote machines. Not only am I having to do a very computationally expensive serialization and deserialization of the data, it really impacts the performance of what I'm doing. Now, to really complete this example, so we've got this nice efficient code now. I'm going to take out the measure because I now actually want to just do something on this. So yes, I can invoke the command. Great. And I actually want to just stop the process. It's not working. Why is it not working? Actually, let's just get the process. It's not working either. Because realize it's just a kind of snapshot view of the objects. I'm trying to take data that is on a remote machine and then trying to look at it on my local machine. It doesn't exist. I have to perform any operations I want on the remote machine as well. So if I want to actually go ahead and then get the process, which this is useless, I've already got the process, but you get the idea, I have to do it on the remote side. If I want to stop it, well, I have to do it on the remote side as well. So there's my notepad still running. If I run this command, and it's gone. So when I'm working with remote machines, realizing what I get back is essentially disconnected. And so if I want to perform actions on it, I have to do it as part of that remote invocation. And also, I really want to filter what I'm getting back to be as efficient as I possibly can. When I run things on multiple remote machines at the same time, it's actually running them in parallel. But by default, it's actually throttled to 32 concurrent connections. I can change that with a throttle limit parameter, so I can modify that behavior. Now, I can also have a session. So if we think about Invoke-Command was really behind the scenes creating a quick instance of a container for my PowerShell, it would run my commands and then it would exit. I can establish a session, which is kind of a long-standing or keep any state. So I'm going to create a session, it's one-to-one. I can create them in advance and then enter the session or send commands to the session, or I can just kind of create it on demand. So let's try a similar experiment again. This time I'm going to say, well, my session is a new PowerShell session on computer. So it's using my credential. Remember, all of these things, I could pass credentials if I wanted to. I could say, well, pass credential, and I could say get credential. Remember, just like math, it will run this first, get the credential, and then send it to that. Or I could do $cred equals get credential. There's all different ways I can populate that. And we'll talk a bit more about credentials when we think about scripting. So I've created a session. So if I now did a get PSSession, I'll see, yep, I have a session on that machine. And if I actually go and look at that machine, go to Task Manager, notice this is running as John. So that is the container for my session. Now within that, I can now run commands against it. Invoke-Command on the session I've established, and I could do the script block again, or I can just start skipping it. We get the idea. Var is 10. Now remember last time, if I set these things, it would disappear. But now I'm running these commands against an established session. So state is maintained between the commands. And then when I'm done, I could say, well, let's look at my session. There it is. And I just want to close it. So I can say remove PSSession. So realize I've got that container object running my session right now. If I close the session, oh, missed an S. It's gone. That is the container for the session that I'm actually doing those things on. Then notice I was running it against the domain controller. To use the default session configuration, which is what we're using here, if I am trying to talk to a domain controller, I have to make sure my account is in the local administrators group. Now on a domain controller, that's built in. So I actually have to go to my DC. If you go to built in, you'd see administrators. And I actually have to go ahead and add my John Saville account into that. These are replicated between DCs, but it's kind of that equivalent of the local admin group. DCs don't have local groups, so built-in is the equivalent set of those groups. So if I wanted to be able to run commands against domain controllers, the same applies to just a regular machine. If I want to use a default session configuration, I have to be essentially, quote, an admin. Domain admins is not added to that by default. So I actually have to go and add my accounts into it. That kind of tripped me up for a little while. So that's me using a session. Now remember, I can do this against multiple machines. So let's now create a list of our domain controllers. In the interest of time, I'm not going to just manually type this stuff in. So I've created a little array. An array is multiple objects. In this case, it's 2 strings. They are my 2 domain controllers. And I could invoke commands. So I can do Invoke-Command. And I could say I want to do it on the computers, because I can send multiple machines. So I'm going to send it the array of strings. And I want to run, for now, we're being lazy, just wanted to prove this out, show me the computer names. So it's running those against the remote machines. And sure enough, yep, that's the right things. Likewise, I can create sessions on multiple machines. So if I do a new PS session on computers, my DCs. So now if I look at sessions, I've got two. I've got one on each of my domain controllers. So I could do exactly that same command again, my Invoke-Command, but instead of doing computer names, I could say session, my sessions I have. And I'm doing get computer name, and notice how quick that is. The sessions now exist, so it's super fast. But I could be far more interesting. I could do things like installing a Windows feature. I could deploy a certificate. So you start to get the idea of the power of what I can actually do. And I have all of these sessions. So session, the first one, array item 0, square brackets, a number is which item in the array. They start from 0. So that's my first session. So I could actually go ahead and interactively work with this. I could do Enter-PSSession. And I could just say session, the first one, if I remember to type 2 S's, which I keep forgetting. Now I'm on that box. Get my processes, get services. Oh. I'm on the remote machine, exit, get PS sessions. Eventually, by the end of this course, I'll remember to do 2 S's and get PS session. And there they are. And if I'm kind of done, then obviously I can just remove them, or I could just remove the ones in my variable, pipe them to remove PS session. And remember, so right now, if I look at my task manager, what it would have done, my details, is it created me this on each of my DCs, and it's gone. So that's what we're doing behind the scenes. Now this is great, and I can do all these great things when I'm on that remote machine. But there's another level. I can actually import modules from a remote session and then execute them. This is known as implicit remoting. Now, what is important to remember though, is it is running on the remote machine. Although the module appears to be on my local machine, it's still running remote. So if I try and mix these commands with things on my local machine, it's going to get confused. So basically it's a way that I can run commands remotely in just this very implicit manner. I'm not having to go and create sessions and connect to the session and then run the command. The module will appear to just be locally on my box. So I'm on my Windows 10 machine and I'm PowerShell Core. Now with 1809, we do have RSAT tools kind of built in now, if you've not seen that. There is AD modules now available. It's actually interesting what they've done. So if you kind of do available features, it's not finding it for me. I don't know. Let's just do settings. What is this doing? Go away. Okay. Just go to settings. And if we do features, so you can do add optional feature. And what we're seeing now is we have all these components like the SSH client, which we're going to use later on, is just part of 1809 and Windows Server 2019. I can do add a feature, and now the RSAT tools are just available. And you'll see that Active Directory is there. So that's not important to what we're doing right now. It's just kind of a good thing to know. They've made these really cool further improvements about these hybrid environments. But I right now don't have the AD module. I've not installed that module. So if I was to do import module and I did Active Directory, it's because I had no idea what you're talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a session to my domain controller. So I'm going to do new PS session. I don't remember the two S's. There we go. And my computer name is one of my DCs. I'm going to import a module, and I'm going to import module Active Directory. And I'm going to import it from my AD session. If I do get module, I've got Active Directory. Now notice something though. Module type is a script. If I'm actually on the real DC and I import module Active Directory and I do get module, Active Directory, well, it's a true module. I have a manifest for it. So it's given us a hint. Something kind of strange is happening, but that's okay. All good things. If I do my get command, module Active Directory, I've got all my commands there. Seems good. If I was to compare this to my remote box, my actual DC, I got all the same things. These are called commandlets. This one's called functions. Again, hinting, it's doing something a little bit different. But to me, actually using it, I don't care. Hey, look, I can do get AD user. Just give me everything. I can run all of these commands. What is it doing? So if I do $C equals get command, and I say get AD user, what is $C? $C is a function. And more specifically, if I look at the definition, what is this doing? I'm passing it all the various parameters that I would normally use as part of get AD user, and it's essentially bundling them up. And it's basically going to run this against a session. What session? Well, it's running it against the session that I created. So when I'm running get AD user, it's a function that has been automatically created on my local machine when I imported the module, a function for every single commandlet in that module. And when I run them, it's calling this function, which then sends the command actually to the remote machine for the execution, and then serializes the objects and sends them back to me. Because if I actually do get AD user, get member, it's deserialized. Yes, it's an AD user. Again, showing me it's running remotely. And while that's important, is I have to kind of think of the same way when I'm running these commands, realize they're all going to run in the remote box. If I try to then mix doing things locally and remotely, it's probably not going to behave how I'm expecting it. So just realize I'm essentially running those commands via a kind of like an Invoke-Command. It's just completely transparent to me. And you may kind of wonder, hey, look, why is it doing this ampersand script? Ampersand is the execution operator. So let's say I'm going to create a command. So it's just a string, a variable, and I'm going to do get process. If I do $command, is it going to get the processes for me? No, it's going to just output a string. It doesn't care what's in there. But if I add ampersand in front of it, then it executes it. So ampersand is the execution operator. We'll see that in other things sometimes. So that's what's happening in this function behind the scenes. It's saying execute this variable, and then all these various components of it. So that's what that implicit remoting is doing. It's creating a whole bunch of functions that redirect to that session I created. And I can even prefix it. And where this is nice is, imagine I'm working on multiple machines with different versions of modules. Ordinarily, I couldn't install multiple versions of the same module. It'd get very confused. It would clash. Well, I'm going to do remove module, Active Directory. So that's gone. I'm going to import that module again from my session, but this time I'm going to prefix it with on DC, i.e. on my domain controller. Get module. So I've still got my Active Directory module, but look at the commandlets now. They've all had on DC added to the noun. And I can use them the same way. So now, instead of get AD user, it's on DC. And I still do tab completion because it's created those functions for me. I've got all of these things here. Get AD user, filter, star, and it's just working. So this is amazingly powerful. This is a great thing you're going to use a lot, because now I could maybe have connections into different DCs running different versions, different Exchange servers with all their command tools available. Implicit remoting is phenomenal. And we see this in one other place. So compatibility. With compatibility, PowerShell Core is getting better and better. It's adding more commandlets. 1809 has even more than before, but there are still some things that do not work. But there is a compatibility module that helps with this. So if I was to do, remember, my get module, and I can say list available, and I'm going to skip the addition check, I'll see a whole bunch of these that just say desktop, i.e. I am not going to run on PowerShell Core, which the addition is core. And I'm like, oh, that's a bummer. Because what I really want to do is use the Microsoft PowerShell management module. Because that's going to let me use get event log. Remember, I can use get win event, it's not a big deal, but just as an example, I really, really, really miss get event log. There's a project, Windows PowerShell Compatibility. Now I can go and check this out. So here's the project. I just went to github.com PowerShell/Windows Compatibility. And this is going to let me use those other types of modules. It's got all the installation instructions, and it's actually got a test using get event log. So if I actually go and look at this thing, actually let's go back to that. We'll open up our PowerShell session. I have to install the module, and it tells you how to do that. Install module, Windows Compatibility, and the scope is going to be my current user. And I already have it, so it's not really going to do anything, but that would install it. Now, if I try to do get event log, it has no clue what I'm talking about. But I can do import win module now, and I want to install the Microsoft.PowerShell.management module. And now it's there. I can go and get, hey, I want my newest 5 from security. I'm not elevated. So to actually do things really useful, I would actually run this as administrator. So I should have run this elevated. But it's there now. And it's doing exactly the same thing. if I actually go and look at my command, I do get command, get event log, and then we look at, it's a function again. And just like our implicit remoting, well, this looks kind of super familiar. It's executing a command with all the things that we're passing to it again. And if I do a get PS session, let's have a look. So it has to run it against something. It's created a compatibility session to itself, to localhost. So that's what this module does. It essentially creates a session to itself, creates functions for all the commandlets in the module, which makes it appear like I'm running them. So kind of a cool thing, we have that option. Remember though, for event log, I can do get win event. I can do exactly the same thing. And I could say max events 5. Again, unauthorized right now, just to prove this does actually work. She's probably doubting me at this point. If I just run this as administrator. There. So I don't have to do get event log. I can just use get win event. So I have that capability, but it's a useful module. It's going to get less useful over time just because with every version of Windows, Microsoft are adding more and more commandlets that now just work with PowerShell Core. This is the future. So everything is being enhanced for it. Now I've been connecting to that default session configuration. And I showed you that get PS session configuration command shows all those different endpoints. If I was to run that again, you can see I've got my regular default, I've got workflows, I've got a 32-bit endpoint, and server manager workflows. So these are the endpoints I can connect to. There may be times where I don't want to expose that entire endpoint, that default, because it can do anything. I might want to give the ability to have a limited set of commands that I can execute. So GIA, just enough administration, a huge focal point today. When we think about IT security, the days of standing privileges are gone. The days of just making someone administrator, because that's kind of an easy way for me to work out what they need, are gone. Instead, we really want to think about now, what are the minimum permissions required to get that job done, and give them only as required. We might hear that called JIT, just in time. So both of those are kind of critical things that we want. And this gives me this ability in PowerShell. What I can do is I can create these alternate endpoints, and then I can pass a configuration name which specifies which endpoint I actually want to run against. And I've got a little example script here. So what this does is it just creates a new session configuration. I'm only allowing certain modules. I've got my own custom one called OneTech, an Active Directory and PowerShell utility. I'm only exposing my OneTech AD format help commandlets. I'm only exposing a few basic functions like tab expansion. I'm exposing a few aliases, exit, format table, format list. I'm going to constrain the language so they can't just put something in squiggly brackets and run anything they want. I'm exposing the file system, but I'm really locking this thing down. And so now, once I register this new configuration name, this DCMs, my data center managers, they'll only be able to run this limited set of commands. Now I can also build on this and add ACLs to say, well, who is allowed to actually connect to this? And if you look at the sample code for this module 3 from the GitHub, I kind of expand this out. So here I'm in my Visual Studio Code. I've opened up my folder. I'm actually going to go and by my source control, I don't think I have the latest version. So remember, I can go and pull down the latest, go back to my project, and in the sample code, close that down. If we go and look for module 3 here, if I actually go and I've got all the code that I've been showing you so far. For the endpoint, here I've got all that code. Then I actually go into the detail of creating the security to limit only these particular people can use that endpoint. So the code actually expands even more than what I've got in the slides. So just hopefully that's kind of a useful thing. And don't forget to pull down the most recent version when you're doing these things. Okay. Robust connections. So improvements made over the various different versions of PowerShell 3 will try and detect an unexpected loss of connectivity between the client and the server. And we'll actually try and reestablish the connectivity and resume any kind of execution, again, automatically. It's going to keep trying for up to 4 minutes. I can disconnect from a session and then reconnect, and the state is maintained. So another kind of nice capability there. So if I was to jump over, and if we say my session is new PS session, hang on, I'm getting the PS session right this time. There we go. And I'll say actually I'll give it a name this time. Name for the session, DC1 sesh, and the computer is my machine. If I do a get PS session, so I've still got my compatibility session, remember, because I imported in that compatibility module, but I've got my DC1 session. I can disconnect that session. So if I do disconnect, in fact, before I do that, let's invoke a command on that session. And we'll say $var equals 50. I'm going to disconnect my PS session identity number 2. If I do my get PS session again, it's disconnected. If I look on my domain controller, go to my details, it's still there. And then I can just connect it again. So I can say, okay, well, let's connect this session. ID 2. And then let's try and look at that var, and it's there. So now I've got this far more robust way I can interact with them. And I'm going to just close that. So just more robust, it's going to automatically kind of heal itself if it can, if there's problems. Now, authentication can be a very interesting one when dealing with remote machines. Ordinarily, the account I'm logged in as is going to be the account it's going to use on the remote machine. Now, even though WinRM is running as local system, it's still going to use my credential. And my credential can be used on that remote machine, but it cannot hop. And what that means is, if I'm running a command on a remote machine, and then on that remote machine, I'm somehow issuing other commands or API calls that go against other remote machines, it's not allowed to use my credential. Again, that would be hopping my credential. Essentially, something else that I've given permission to use my credential is trying to use my credential again against something else. And we're using Kerberos behind the scenes for all of this authentication, and it's just not going to allow it. And we can see this in action. If I was to enter a PS session on a box, so I'm on that remote machine. Now if I try and run a command, taking its time, on a remote machine, And I'm going to do get host. It's failing. I can't do it. It's giving me a Kerberos authentication error. And it's given me a number of reasons why this might be. And one of them is around, well, accept domain names, different domains, authentication methods. It's just not happy. It's not going to let me bounce my credential. If I want to hop, then I can use CredSSP. This is an alternative to Kerberos. And then once I enable CredSSP, then I can tell it as part of the command to use CredSSP for the authentication, and I have to pass it a credential when I'm doing that. Now this means I have to set up CredSSP. There's a number of different steps I have to do that. On the local machine, as the client, I have to actually set the client authentication to true. And this is all in the sample file. But if I actually just go to wsman, localhost, client, auth, you can see CredSSP here is set to false. Because I'm on that remote DC still. I keep doing this, so let's exit this. I don't want to be on that machine. I know I set this up already. So let's run that command again. So if I go to cd wsman, and I go to my local host, client, auth. So CredSSP is set to true. Phew. So that's on the machine running the commands. On the machine I'm connecting to, I have to enable the server side. So in this case, we'll look at this machine. And we'll go wsman over here. So this is the machine I'm connecting to that will then run these commands on other boxes on my behalf. I'm saying, yep, you're allowed to use CredSSP. So this time it's my local host again, but this time it's to serve this part, auth. Notice what I'm doing here. I'm navigating this just like a regular file system. Now, on this box is actually set to false. This isn't the box I'm using. This is my DC, whereas I'm going for my DS box. But basically, this would just be set to true. Now, there's one other item that I have to have configured. Essentially, I want to allow delegation of fresh credentials. Now, I could manually set this directly kind of on an individual machine. So on my client, I would have to configure this. So I could do kind of set item. In fact, if I actually look at where I am, I'm in the wsman localhost client. I could set local configuration. So I could set this trusted hosts value to the machines I want to allow for delegation. I'm going to talk more about this in a second. But essentially, I can do a set item on this and set this to a particular value. Or instead of doing it via individual machines in a domain, well, I can use group policy. I have an object for credential delegation, and I've set the parameter for allowing delegation of fresh credentials to asterisk or wildcard.saviltech.net. So I can use this to anything within my domain space. So now let's try that example again. So I want to go and enter a session on my remote machine, and there's the name. But notice I'm changing the authentication now to CredSSP, and I have to pass it a credential. So I'm just going to say, well, get credential, which will make me enter it. And let's see if this works. So I can say, well, my domain user, my password, and it's failing. Why is it failing? Well, what was my configuration for what I'm allowing fresh credentials to be sent to? It was wildcard.saviltech.net. I'm not entering something.saviltech.net. So what I actually have to do here is put in the fully qualified name. Now, if I wanted to, I could add the individual machines, and then I could use the short name. I could add IP addresses. But that's not what I've done. So now I can connect again. And this time it's connected. So it's now connected using Cred SSP. So now I should be able to do that second hop. It should be able to use my credential against something else. So now if I try my command, it's now working. So the Cred SSP is solving the problem of that second hop. Now that is one option. I could also use Kerberos, constrained resource-based delegation, providing it's in a kind of trusted domain, trusted forest. So if I go back to my example again, instead of entering a session to my DS box, I'm just going to enter a session. I'm going to get rid of all of the Cred SSP. I'm just going to try and run exactly the same thing against a domain controller. And I'm going to try and invoke a command against a different domain controller. And that works. So why is this working? Well, this is working because this is now using Kerberos resource-based delegation. This keeps all the benefits of Kerberos. It's just maybe a little bit more to set up potentially. So the way this works is if I look at my actual computers, and the reason I picked a domain controller is I'm being lazy. Domain controllers, in fact, before I talk about domain controller, a regular machine. Let's look at that DSO one where it failed. I can do delegation. I do not trust this computer for delegation, i.e., it's not going to let me receive credentials from another box. Whereas my domain controllers, this is just by default. If I look at the box that was trying to receive the credentials, it's trusted for delegation to any service using Kerberos. That's why that worked. So this is me configuring, or in this case, it's done for me for domain controllers, resource-based delegation. So this would be another option that would solve that second hop requirement. Additionally, I could use certificate authentication when I'm using SSL. So outside trusted domains, I need mutual authentication for Cred SSP, or if I'm not using the name, DNS alias, IP addresses. So either I use certificate-based, or I can add it to the trusted host list, which I mentioned earlier. And so here's all the different options. I can clear it out so it's blank. I could set it to IP addresses. I could set it to a particular domain, which is what I have in my environment. I could set it to anything. And that's typically a pretty bad thing. I don't want to enable it for anything. Or I can set it to blank again. So these are the options I have to actually go ahead and configure that trusted host. Just some troubleshooting information with remote connectivity. Now, typically, this really isn't a big deal today. This used to be a much bigger problem in the early days of remoting. Today, it's pretty much enabled everywhere. It just works. But if you were having problems, you can try and telnet to the node port 5985. I can look in the applications and service logs, and I can look in the Microsoft Windows PowerShell operational. I can see information about the connections. I can even import a diagnostics module, enable a trace, do any commands I'm trying to do that are failing, and then disable the trace, and then go ahead and look at that log. So that will give me even more information about exactly what's going on. So that's just some troubleshooting resources. And what I would actually recommend at this point is there's a phenomenal ebook, Secrets of PowerShell Remoting. It's $5. You can actually get it free. There's like a recommended amount, and you should kind of pay for these things. The authors spend a lot of time on these resources. So you can see it's leanpub.com, Secrets of PowerShell Remoting. I linked to it. Actually, if you go to the GitHub page in the help, I should refresh this, a bit out of date. But for some of the references, I talk about Secrets of PowerShell Remoting ebook, so I linked to it there. But well worth $5. It goes into a phenomenal amount of detail of setting all of this stuff up, all of the troubleshooting I'm talking about. Absolute recommended resource. I can use HTTPS, IESSL. Now, I need a certificate. This helps me confirm the identity of the target server. It uses a separate SSL encrypted connection and port that I have to enable. Now, for the certificate, I can use a self-signed cert. If I'm just testing, messing around, sure. But that really defeats most of the benefits of using a certificate. So I could use a certificate from an internal certificate authority, an enterprise CA, or I could use an external CA. But the name in the certificate must match the name I'm actually using to connect with. So I have set this up on one of my servers. So if I actually go and look at this machine, if I jump over, if I look at my certs, I have a server authentication certificate that was issued by my enterprise CA. So I created my own certificate template, Web Server 2016, and I created a certificate request. That was then issued by the enterprise CA. And because it's my enterprise CA, that will be trusted by any machine in my domain, because my enterprise CA will automatically get added to the trusted root of all of my machines. So it just happens automatically. So now I have that certificate, I can go ahead and actually enable HTTPS connections. Now, to actually find and use the certificate, remember the cert store is, just clear that, is a namespace. If I do my get PS drive, I'll see I have my certificates. So within here, I want to look at the ones on my local machine. And I want to look at my ones, the ones I've actually requested. And I can do an ls, and I'll see all of the different certificates. And I want this one, the one I requested for my server authentication. And I need this thumbprint. Now, if you try and look at it in the GUI, the thumbprints actually don't seem to match properly. If I was to look at this exact same cert, and you can see various details. There's information about it, but this thumbprint is not matching. They output in different formats, and it's this format I need. So I need to get it by dumping this out from the PowerShell. Now, once I have this, I have to use WinRM to actually create my HTTPS listener using that thumbprint. I'm not going to try and type all of that out here, but the good news is, as you would expect, it's in the sample for this course. So if I actually jump over to the sample file, talk about alternate endpoints, and I enable HTTPS. So I talk about getting the keys, and then I've got the WinRM create. So I'm actually using a PowerShell commandlet here. I'm just using WinRM. You have to put in your full host name, and then you put in the certificate thumbprint. So you run that command. Then you run a command to enable HTTPS for remote management. And then you're kind of good to go. I've enabled HTTPS on that machine. So back on my server, I've run all those commands already. I can actually enumerate my WinRM config listeners. And you can see I have my standard one that was created automatically just by Windows, that's there. And I have my HTTPS one for my full host name using that certificate I specified. So I should now be able to use SSL. So let's minimize that. Go back to my PowerShell window. So to connect, we just add use SSL. And I could also add a credential if it's outside the domain, or I just want to use credential. I can do things like skip the certificate authority checking, skip the certificate name checking. I could even skip revocation. Both of those options are fine in a lab. In the real world, you probably shouldn't be skipping those things. But let's try that. So I'm going to do Invoke-Command. And we're going to run it against computer name, Sav, Azure US, SC. And my script block, go to our old standard, we just dump out the computer name. So is this going to work? Well, I need to tell it to use SSL. Is it going to work? No, that's odd. Server certificate on a database computer has the following error. Contains a common name. Oh, remember, what was my certificate? The certificate is the full name. So I have to add the full name in here, and then it's going to work. To prove those options, I can create an array of options. And my options could be a new PSSession option object. And I'm going to skip the CA check. I'm going to skip. There's a lot of different options here. I'm just going to type skip. I'm going to skip the CN check, and I'm going to skip the revocation check. Skipping everything. So now I'm going to try and invoke that command again with just the short name, and I'm going to pass it my session options that I created. Oh, it's called options, not option. And that works. Because basically I'm saying, look, I don't care about the certificate authority if you trust it or not. I don't care about the name. I don't even care about the revocation. Just use the certificate. So that's why that now works. And I'm using Invoke-Command. I could do Enter-PSSession. They're all going to work the same way. Final point. I'm a Windows guy. But the whole point of PowerShell Core, and even Windows PowerShell, is I can work outside of just Windows. PowerShell Core really embraces that cross-platform experience. I can run PowerShell Core on Windows, on Linux, on Mac OS. I can run Visual Studio Code on Windows, on Linux, on Mac OS. It really does embrace this complete, consistent experience no matter what the platform. Now, WinRM is commonly used for remote management, but I can also use SSH for both Linux and Windows. I can actually also use WinRM on Linux. There's OMI. So if I install OMI on Linux, and this has been around for a long time, the open management infrastructure, I could use WS-Man against Linux. But I don't want to do that. So instead, I want to use SSH. Now, I'm going to focus only on Windows managing Linux. Realize I could also enable Linux managing Windows. I could install the OpenSSH server on my Windows box. And as I kind of mentioned before, if I go back to my settings, to be able to use SSH, I need the SSH client. Now I could download the OpenSSH, but if I'm Windows 10 1809 or Windows Server 2019, if I just search for features, well, OpenSSH client is now built in to Windows 10 1809 and Windows Server 2019. Likewise, if I wanted to be able to use SSH into Windows Server 2019 or Windows 10, SSH Server is just available. Now, if you're running an older OS, I can just download and install OpenSSH client and server. So I need those components. Now, on the Linux side, I also need to obviously install PowerShell on my Linux box. And then I need to enable the OpenSSH server on Linux to leverage PowerShell as a listener. So there's a few steps I have to do on the Linux side. So first thing, you have to install PowerShell Core on Linux. And I'm not going to go through that, but what I've got is a link in the references to installing PowerShell Core on, for example, Ubuntu. So if we open it up quickly, there's really not a lot. You just run these commands. That's literally what I have to do. And then the next step is to enable SSH remoting to it. You have to basically just open up a file. It's really all I had to do is SSH deconfig. Actually, that's the Windows one. Hold on. Here we go. You have to open up the SSH deconfig file under etc SSH. This was already set for me. You just have to add in this line. That's setting up that listener. Now, once you've done that, I'll now be able to actually use PowerShell on Linux. So if we jump over here really quickly, I'm going to try and SSH in as me. So I create a user on the Linux box. So I'm going to SSH into the box. Put in my password. So I'm on that box now. PWSH. I'm now running in PowerShell on Linux. Get process. Oh, all of this stuff. Sorry, I'm not don't have the right privileges there, but whatever. That's PowerShell running on that box. So okay. So let's exit this. So I've closed that connection and clears. So now what I want to show is, well, can I just run a command? So if I do Invoke-Command, now I'm using host name. It's a big difference here. Host name instead of computer name. Host name is what tells it to use SSH. So I'm going to use Sav, Azure, US South Central, Linux 01. My script block. Let's do get process. And I have to pass it a username is John. It's going to prompt me for my password. And there are ways to sort of include all of this. And it works. So I'm running against a remote Linux box. But I don't have to do anything different here. So I can create a new PS session. So I'm going to create one to a computer name. I'm going to use WinRM. And I'm going to connect to just a server. I'm going to create another session to a host name. So I'm going to use OpenSSH. And we'll connect to our Linux box. And I have to give it a username. So now if I do a get PS session, I have two, and I've still got that compatibility one. So I actually want to remove PS session. I don't want that. So there. And there's a clean way to uninstall that. I don't care about that right now. So I've got two sessions, and actually what I want to do is store them. So I can actually do an out variable to store them in something called sesh. I could do exactly the same thing by just doing $sesh equals get PS session. It's just another way of doing it. So if I look at $sesh, there are my two sessions. So now I'm going to invoke a command against I could do session, $sesh, but I don't have to do that. I could just do $sesh. I'm doing my script block. I don't have to do that either. I could just do squiggly brackets. Get any process ending in S. is combining them. I just ran a command against two boxes, Windows and Linux, a mixture of WSMan and SSH, completely transparently. That's where this is just a ridiculous amount of power now. I'm doing this against two boxes. This could be 200. They're running in parallel. That's the nice thing about Invoke-Command. It's not doing one, then the other. These are all, I could be 100 boxes going to finish in the same time. This really starts to give you an idea of exactly what I can do with PowerShell. So there's me just talking about how I can use these things. Make sure you're using hostname for SSH. So next we'll be covering a script. As I kind of showed before, all of the assets are on the GitHub. I'm updating the sample PS1 file each week. I actually rearranged a few things. Some of the least used things I just moved to an assets folder. And as usual, I'll be updating the playlist for the PowerShell Master Class. Now it's got the first 2 weeks. By the time you're looking at this, it will have this session as well. Hope this is useful. Hope to see you on the next class, and good luck.